Hi, folks. My name is Sarah Bryden. I am the chair of the Finance, Operations, and Personnel Committee of the Portland Public School Board of Education. Today is February 13th, 2023. It is 4:32, and I'm calling this committee meeting to order. Welcome, those of you that are watching along on the internet. In terms of committee members in attendance this afternoon, we have Board Member Opperman, Board Member Figdor, and myself. Board Member Youssef is not able to attend today. And then in terms of board members who are not part of this committee but are attending, we have Board Chair Lentz over the phone. I want to just sort of super quickly do a little housekeeping item, then give the highlights of the agenda, and then turn it over to the staff to walk through the actual agenda. Just super quickly, in the last committee meeting, I indicated that in this committee meeting, we would have 2 rounds of meeting minutes to vote on. That was just the function of me being new to the committee chairship. And I have since learned that our board policies do not require written minutes for committee meetings. So that's not part of our conversation today. What is part of our conversation today is our exciting agenda. So first, there's going to be a discussion of fiscal year 23 budget to actuals, a mid-year summary of where we are. There's going to be a discussion of fiscal year 24 budget process, a preliminary discussion of that, and then also an update on the IRS penalties that were in the paper the other day. So we have 90 minutes scheduled, and I will, because there is so much content to go through, I will turn it over to staff to walk us through the documents that are up on board docs.
All right, so I will be starting off with the mid-year summary of budget to actuals. So there are 2 summaries attached to board docs. I'm not going to bring those up or go over those in any particular detail unless committee members want to after my presentation slides. But I'm just going to go over some kind of trying to distill the pertinent pieces of where we are on expenditures and where we are on revenue. That's what I'll be doing in the slides. So let me just share my screen. And can everybody see my screen? Okay. So just a high-level summary. So the FY23 budget this year is $133.1 million. If you saw the summaries, you can see the bottom lines. We are just a hair under 50% spent, and in terms of revenue, just a hair under 50% collected. So from a high-level perspective, pretty much vaguely what you would expect to see around this time of year. You may have noticed, and I just wanted to point out for anyone who was concerned about it, that our regular salaries are showing just a bit over 50% expended. But the way the payroll calendar worked out this year, we actually had 3 payrolls in July and 3 payrolls in December, which is not always the case. Sometimes we have 3 in August and 3 in January, which makes it proportional at a mid-year summary point, but this year there's 14 out of 26 that are already included in those numbers. So if you kind of control for that variable, we would be just about 47% spent, which is more what we would expect to see this time of year. And that's
sorry. Yep. Can I ask a foundational question? I'm curious about whether the summaries go up through the end of December because that's the 6-month mark. Is that?
Yes, I do. This is a kind of a quarterly report that I generally do. And so that's the end of the second quarter. Okay. It's February 13th. Generally, we don't close a month till the 15th. So, I wouldn't really be ready for Yeah. So really, this is a quarter 2.
Sure. It's not intended to be like a snapshot in time of where we are right at this very moment. And that's just correct. By design. Right. Okay. Thanks.
That's correct. Yep. So 14 out of 26 payrolls. So that would put us about 47% spent. So just wanted to make that note for anyone who kind of honed in on that particular statistic. And as far as revenue goes, just about half general fund, a little bit more than half with adult ed, which is really just a timing thing where they get their whole state subsidy up front, and food services at 47%, which is actually high at this point because food services really runs on a 10-month revenue calendar starting in September. So really, I would expect them to be closer to 40% now, and they're high. So that is a good thing. All right, so starting with expenditures, things that I really just want to note for you, and we can have a discussion if you have any questions at the end. But looking at the year as a whole, I am sort of projecting forward to have a surplus in regular salaries and benefits. We do have quite a few vacancies, about 57 on local at this, about a month ago when I pulled the latest vacancy data. And then we do, though, however, as we do generally every year, have some unbudgeted FTE additions that we made over the course of the year due to unanticipated needs and enrollment fluctuations. So I'm anticipating this is extremely rough. It's still fairly early in the year. And some of the payroll challenges have made our data a little bit tougher to sift through at this point in time, but a very rough estimate of about 1.2 million left over in vacancy savings after accounting, net of unbudgeted additions that we've made through the year. Additionally, some of you may know, others may not, depending on whether you were on the board last year. We have 1.3 million approximately in custodial positions budgeted in our local budget this year that are actually being charged to federal funding. And so this is a surplus that has been expected and anticipated to be rolling into reserves. And that was by design. So that is also part of the figure in terms of what I expect to be on the bottom line in regular salaries and benefits at the end of the year. Anticipating a, bit of a surplus in workers' comp, just something that came up looking at this review. We have those figures in for the rest of the year, and we're going to have some savings there. And then debt service, this I think is going to be new to everybody. And it's a little confusing, so let me do my best to explain. But we have state-funded debt service for the Rowe School. Back at the time when we did the construction, it was called the Hall School. And the state actually made a reduction to what they fund for our debt service in our ED 279 this year. So we had $1 million less, 1.2 million less in our EPS funding this year for that state-funded debt service because the state expected us to pay for some of that debt service this year in unspent bond proceeds that we had in the project account. So the project came to a close, I don't know, a year and a half ago. This is a before my time project, but and it's accounted for on the city side. But the kind of final reports on that project came in, and that became apparent to the state that we were going to be able to pay some of our debt service with those unspent bond proceeds. So we did not actually have to budget that expenditure this year, but we did. I am not certain if we did because of the timing of when this all played out with the state, or if we decided to budget it because we're going to have to pay it next year. This is just a one-time thing. But the good news is that we do not have to pay that out of our budget. And so we should have that in surplus at the end of this year.
Because we had planned to pay it.
What's that?
Because we had planned to pay it and now we don't have to?
That's correct.
Okay, super. Thank you so much. Board Member Figdor, I see you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yes. Miranda, this was a decision made at the state level, because I know this has been such a moving target for us in terms of working with the city. And I guess it's spurring for me the question of, and perhaps we get to it later, but, have we made progress getting a better sense from the city of how we're able to pay our debt service? Because that has really influenced our budgeting over the years without having a lot of clarity. And so it's just raising for me the question of whether we've made progress working with the city to better understand their plan and to be able to use that for our budgeting process.
I think the answer is yes. I mean, from my perspective, I know that leading up to this coming budget process over the last couple of weeks, I have spoken with Brendan several times about our debt service and talked to them a lot about this because I didn't know this either before kind of returning to the position this year. So we've been working together to understand this, make the adjustments in our debt service to date this year, and then also to get a clear understanding of, for me, too, what is left in BFOF that we're going to have come on next year. I mean, we know that next year. What about the year after? And I do feel like I have a clear picture, and we're going to get to that, I'm sure, at some point during the budget process. I intend to look at our debt service reserve and try to put together a multi-year plan for how to cover that moving forward. So I guess it's a long answer to your question, but I feel personally that I have a lot of clarity from them and that they've been really helpful to date so far in this process this year.
Excellent. That's great news. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
And just while we're paused for a moment, I have another sort of foundational question before you start back up, which this is so helpful. I'm curious. So the custodial positions, the 1.3 million can go over to reserves. I'm curious about whether the 1.2 million for vacancies, whether that can be treated in the same way or whether there are constraints around that.
It can be. It could be if we didn't have any projected deficits below that I haven't talked about yet. But
Okay.
Yes, definitely the net, most of that, 100%, the intention is to have it roll to reserves so that we can then hopefully reclass it to the debt service reserve to pay for future debt service.
Okay, so I'm just confirming that both for myself as a newer member, of the board and the finance committee, and also for community members, I'm confirming that it's not a, spend it or lose it sort of situation.
Nope, unspent budget will roll into our fund balance at the end of the year.
Okay, great. Thanks. Onward.
Okay, so projected deficits for this year, we have a significant over budget expectation in special ed tuition for this year. There are a few students at more expensive schools than we typically have placements at for a few different reasons. I don't want to this is going to be a topic of conversation moving forward into the budget process. So I don't want to get too deep into the weeds. I just want to make you aware of this. And we also have more students being placed out of district. So this is obviously a significant over budget figure of $800,000. We have kind of attached to that additional transportation obligations for students out of district. And that's another $300,000 that we're estimating at this point in contracted routes for special ed students out of district. We have additional costs for our ADP implementation and related contractual services from Munis, project manager, Spingleff contract, things related to the payroll circumstances, and estimating those at about $350,000 at this point. And pertinent to your question about debt service and whether it will roll forward into fund balance, we have a school bus purchase plan that is a bit new. So let me explain. We basically apply. So every year there's a state, I don't know if you're aware of the fact that the state funds bus purchases. So we have to apply to get a state approved bus, but if the state approves a bus purchase, they will actually fund it for us, but in next year's state subsidy. So it creates a bit of an unusual cycle in terms of when you buy the buses, when you get the funding, how you fund the bus purchases if you're not getting the money until the following year. So usually the cycle goes apply for the bus year one, and then you get approval and buy the bus, and then you get the money the following year. But we applied for emergency bus approvals this year. We got approved, but we didn't know we were going to buy the buses or have this emergency need, so we didn't budget it. They're approved, so we'll get money from the state next year, but we can't buy the buses unless we have the funds to do so. However, thankfully, we do have the funds to do so from, you could call it from any of the surpluses I noted before, but I think it's cleaner to consider it coming from the row debt service that has freed up. So we want to take advantage of these approvals and purchase these buses, 3 buses, and estimating that at about $375,000. So there's a significant need to replace buses. I'm not sure how much this has been discussed in past ops meetings, but I spoke to transportation just today about it, and the sort of surge in the need to replace buses this year and next year, which we'll talk about more during the budget process, is really from our purchasing of CNG buses years back that haven't lasted as long as expected. So once those buses are replaced, the fleet will be in better shape and there won't be so many buses like that we need each year, because we want to do another, I think it was, three next year with state funding and 3 on CIP. So 6 buses next year too. So that is, so the last episode that I wanted to point out here. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah, Board Member Opperman, go ahead.
Thank you. Miranda, are those bus purchases separate from the ones that we were going to do through SIP?
Yeah, there's several that were purchased through CIP last year that never came in. So we're going to receive them this year, but they're funded from CIP before. And then there's another one that was approved in CIP this year that is also forthcoming. This is in addition. And then there's 3 next year. I'd have to pull it up and I don't have.
That's what I thought. That was when we were saying 3 buses. I was trying to figure which 3 buses.
Yeah, 3 for next year. There's like 9 in total, I think. And we should probably look at the whole bus thing on its own at some other point in time, with transportation in the room. But yes, there were 3 next year that were CIP, and then this is an addition. We have an additional 3 approvals from the state for 3 more buses for next year too. So we got 6 approvals from the state, 3 to buy this year, 3 to buy next year.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else before I move next?
Go ahead.
Oh, I should have told you this before, not to worry about doing the math in your head, but this is the math on the stuff that I said on the prior slide. So comes down to a net surplus of things I mentioned of approximately $2 million. And I do want to note, and this is really more for your information, I'm not terribly concerned about it at this moment in terms of it being a constraint. But as you may recall, when you go to vote on our budget at referendum and when you approve the budget as a board, we're required by the state to present the budget in 11 categories, as they're categories that are the required state categories. So they're different from the way we talk about the budget and a lot of things that we present. But it's a very specific 11 state categories. So from those 11 state categories, you cannot just move whatever you want and reallocate during the course of the year. We're only allowed to move up to 5% from one category to another. So just an example of this, debt service, this 1.2 million is actually in a state category that's only, I think it's little more than 6 million in total, because some debt service is actually categorized under facilities, some under transportation, buses, for example. So we're not free to just repurpose the 1.2 million how we see fit. We can only repurpose really 5%. So it's actually not even going to fund quite the full 375,000 of the buses, but about 300,000 we can repurpose from there. And we can utilize other savings for the remaining 75,000 estimate. But I just want you to be aware of that. We want these funds to roll over into surplus anyway. I don't think that we're looking to reallocate them, repurpose all of them anyway, but I just want you to be aware of how that works when we do have surpluses like this.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm curious. So like, for example, the tuition, the $800,000, is that in the same category as any of the numbers above it? Like, would any of those?
Yep. So there's some vacancies in special ed, and this tuition is special ed tuition. So it is a secondary level of management that is challenging because it's not how we have our budget, even in our system. So I was looking at that obviously during this process and thinking, wow, $800,000 for special ed. Hopefully some of our vacancies are in special ed, and they absolutely are. So I think it's probably going to work out. I'm not terribly concerned about it being a challenge, but as we get a little closer to the year, I'll be able to tell better as we get numbers that are a little cleaner in the system and we're more expended.
Okay. This is a really good preliminary set of information. Thank you so much. Any
other questions? All right. So revenue is quick. I think that there's really not much to say about it at this point. The general fund is just coming through pretty much on target. I don't have any material concerns there. The only thing with adult ed tuition for some of their enrichment programs has been lagging. That's been true for a couple of years, related more so to COVID. So I do need to follow up with them just to see if it's just kind of late billings, or we expect to hit our targets, or if we might be a little short there. But adult ed has built up their fund balance the last couple of years, and this is not a large revenue line. So I'm not particularly concerned about it, but if it proves to be persistent, we may need to make some adjustments in the budget for next year. And food services is expecting a surplus. They are also expecting some extra overages on the expense side related to food costs and other rising costs of inputs for them. But overall, we're expecting to be even or better in terms of revenue to expenditures. So no major concerns there as well. So, and that's it.
Thank you. Board Member Opperman, go ahead, ask a question.
I have several. So, Miranda, that was very good. Thank you. And one statement you made in the middle, I really appreciated, and that was the long-term planning piece. The more that can happen, the easier it'll be for everybody in the future, I think. My questions are actually things that aren't on that December 31st completion, but looking at what was in the original budget and from line item type things. So there is a reference in the budget to a legal services, and there's about 88.5K that was left in it as of what you're saying. And I wondered, is that enough to cover what we've got, the budget expenses we had for legal services in January? Do you know?
You're referring to my summaries that were posted on board docs, or are you referring to something else?
I have a copy of the line items from December, and you or somebody gave it to me when I requested it in December to figure out what was what. So there's a certain amount of money, and there's only 88,000 left in it, and as of December. And I just wondered if that's going to be enough to cover our new legal expenses, and if it's not, just to think of that as being, just so I know. So as we look to see where we're headed.
I'm not 100% sure that I know of all pending legal expenses at this point in time, so it's very hard to say yes or no, but I did look at that when I was looking at budget to actuals as one that I think it was over 50% expended. I have to pull it up. I can do that, but...
I know there's only a 38% left from what it was, but I just wondered if that 38% is going to be enough. So it isn't what you know at this point. From the January, February expenses yet.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I haven't looked at it at January or February. I mean, I think it's possible that we could go over. It's not a gigantic line item to begin with, so I wasn't.
That's what I was, and I was just
really concerned about it. But yeah.
Well, I mean, with everything going on, it's one of those things. The other one was kind of related to the same kind of expenses, which was with the purchasing of professional and technical services and software maintenance. There was kind of a standard amount put in the budget. Are we going to go over that, do you think, because of what's going on with the various sundry technical things with payroll?
Software licenses, I mean, I tried to cover that with the overage related to ADP and consulting services, that 350 that I mentioned in the slide. I'm not aware of, I mean, that includes the ADP implementation cost, so I don't know of additional software costs other than what I included in that 350.
There's like 300,000 for the technical services, and there's about 130,000 for software originally budgeted. So that's kind of what I was just wondering. That it may be that's part. ADP was not in there when the budget was approved, or was it? No. Okay, those are the things I don't. Miranda, I've only been on this job for about a month and a half, so I'm trying to catch up, to what everyone else knows or possibly knows. And that's why I got that big humongous thing, and I read the whole thing. It's yay thick. But it's one of the things that was in there was under finance budget was a $10,000 expenditure which wasn't budgeted. Do you know what that, it was a bank fee. Is that related to what that's related to?
I do not know the answer to that offhand. I'd be happy to come back to you. I can look into it, but I don't know.
I just, those are well, what I did was I look, everything is certainly within reason and all. And that was just like, as a person who deals with bank fees, things like that, sort of understanding it, wondering what it would be in. And then the superintendent search was not originally in the budget, so that will have to come out of whatever surplus pieces we have as well. Am I correct? Yes or no, maybe? Because we didn't.
I thought that was part of the either the board or the superintendent's budget. I just can't remember exactly where it was reallocated from, but I believe we've covered that already.
Yeah,
okay.
That's my understanding as well.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So that's part of that board budget piece that I was trying to figure out. There was some transportation in that and the like that I was looking over. And then, okay, thank you very much. You're being very, very helpful. And then, so when we get to all the fines, which I don't care what kind of fine it is, but correct me if I'm wrong, any fines that are going through the legal department to go to teachers for their messed up payrolls will come out of the salary line or group?
Yeah, I don't believe we've actually processed. I don't know if we've actually put any through yet, but we'll make that decision when the time comes exactly what code to use. But yes, it would be.
But it would be in that chunk. That would be in that chunk of money.
Yes, I am considering it as part of the salary projection. I'm not sure exactly how we're going to code it. I haven't really given that a lot of thought yet.
Coding is fine. You can take care of that. I'm just trying to figure that. I think I don't. I think that's it for me. Okay. So your patience.
And just to follow up on that, to make sure that I understood that last bit in terms of what, so I'm going to just say it another way, and then you can tell me whether I'm correct or whether I misunderstood. So the $1.2 million projected surplus for staffing vacancies is essentially the 57 current vacancies, potentially that, at this point, looking ahead, there might be some FTEs that get added in as needs arise, and also factoring in any potential payments we'll have to add in as a result of that review and potential fines we might need to pay to staff. And then you get to the end of that equation and you get 1.2 million. Is that essentially what you're saying?
That's correct. And that's also why I said it's a very rough estimate, because we have not sorted through all of those details yet. But yes.
Okay.
Short answer to your question is yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Super. Okay. Thanks. I'm glad that I was not way off in left field on that. Thanks for confirming. Sorry?
I raised my hand.
Yes, go ahead. Board Member Opperman. Yes.
Aaron Millie, this isn't for you, Miranda, but the question I have is, are we still actively looking for teachers? So some of those vacancies might actually be filled, please.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good. That's all. Thank you.
And as a follow-up, not right now, obviously, it would be helpful to sort of get a sense of, where the vacancies are, sort of to the earlier point about, are they in special ed or are they teachers and that sort of thing. And then also at some point at a future meeting to get a follow-up on some of the vacancies that have been plaguing the finance team, and getting a sort of a where we are on that, a status report. Again, not today, but just voicing something that would be helpful for the future. Okay. Board Member Opperman, is your hand up from before, or do you have a new? Oh, it happens to the best of us, just checking. Okay, so I think we can move on. FY24, here we go.
All right. I said I'm doing these, so here we come. All right. Great. So we want to just walk you through a bit of our budget process. So, Malia, Miranda, and I will all kind of chime in here as we move through. Our goal tonight is to kind of ensure shared understanding, on the part of the Finance Committee as we enter into kind of over the next, couple months, our more formal budget development processes so that, despite the conditions, we can advance a budget that continues to move forward our progress on our Portland Promise goals. So, we'll talk a little bit, just refresher around, or not refresher, but just kind of clarifying where we've landed around some of the timeline issues. We'll give a little context in terms of budget history as in terms of where things stand, and then specifically dive into some of the moves that have been made over the past number of years to support implementation of the Portland Promise. And then we'll get into talking about our current context. So, since the last meeting we had in early January, we certainly have significantly more information to talk about that, is influencing how we're approaching the development of the budget. And then we'll spend a little time with some kind of input and discussion to close this agenda item. So first, again, just a little bit of context for folks who are kind of participating in this process for the first time as, in your current seats as board members. Our process really starts back in December when we begin to prepare some of our non-salary budgets, doing some of the year-to-date assessment, that Miranda just presented, and, beginning to analyze our rollover costs, with the appropriate kind of escalations. Certainly in January as well, as is significant, we get some of the initial revenue projections. So those are some of the building blocks that start to come together over December, January, lead us smack dab into kind of the main month of February, at least from our side, as we're starting to kind of process all that information and make determinations about what we'll put forward in March. So we're kind of thinking about, budget and strategic initiatives, thinking about debt service issues, and any of the other, kind of elements that may influence the budget as we prepare to bring forward, the superintendent's budget in early March. So, we're trying to land some of that stuff internally, roughly by the end of February so that we can move into production of all of the kind of associated budget books and materials that support the superintendent budget presentation. So, that's kind of where things roll out. We have landed and attached on board docs here is the updated Finance Committee and Budget Development timeline that we have worked on with the city folks in terms of our engagements with the City Finance Committee, as well as presentations to the City Council. So these are some of the just kind of key high-level dates. So we'll kick off with our annual kind of public budget forum on Monday, March 6th. That really gives some just kind of context and background for the school, for the Portland community about our budget. We'll be bringing forward in a special meeting on Tuesday, March 14th, our superintendent's budget presentation. There will be a number of meetings in between there, both, with the Finance Committee, with some joint Finance Committee meetings, as well as additional board workshops and hearings, bringing us forward to roughly a month later when the school board will vote to move the budget forward to the City Council. Again, there will be follow-up engagement between that April 11th date and May 15th before we get to a formal City Council vote. So by mid-May, we hope to have our budget out of City Council and teed up for referendum, which will be, again, approximately a month later on June 13th. So certainly coming out of winter break, it begins a very busy budget season, particularly from March through April when we get it forward, get it out of kind of the school board's purview and into the city councils. So those are some of the kind of key dates we're working with as we move through this process. And Miranda, I'll turn it over to you to give us a little context in terms of budget history.
All right, so I'm just going to go through a few context and background building slides. So
Miranda, before you get started, I see board member Figdor has a question.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thanks, board member Bryden. I just noting on the detailed meeting schedule for the budget process that it says that all meetings are going to be hybrid. So I just wanted to better understand that because we haven't been holding committee meetings in person since the start of the pandemic. So I just wanted clarification around that, please.
That was a note, I think, that was on last year's. I probably didn't touch it. It doesn't sound like it was necessarily accurate last year either, but I think it was probably referring to not the committee meetings, but the bigger meetings, which all pretty much are hybrid. So the council meetings and the school board meetings, right? But I can update that for clarity. Thank you for pointing that out.
But then the intention isn't to do our committee meetings in person. These committee meetings in person?
Correct.
No, yeah, there's no,
Okay.
It's intended to remain as we have been meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll continue. So basically, yeah, the purpose of these slides is just to give everybody background context, recognizing that people have been on the board for different lengths of time. So we're just all grounded in some of the basic figures of the budget as we move into the budget season. So starting with just our budget in general. So this slide is just showing you the history of our budget overall. We have fiscal year on the left, the total budget, the change over the prior year, and then the percent change over the prior year. So most recently, 2023, that's this year. Our budget is $133 million, as you know from my last presentation, and that was an increase of $6.6 million over the prior year and 5.2%. As you can see, the percent change has varied somewhat significantly year over year, with the highest in this 7-year picture being 6.2% and the lowest 2.1% in 2021. So this is just a picture basically of what we spend our money on. I think most of you know this, but it's important to note that about 80% of our budget is in salaries and benefits, about 8% in contractual services, 8% debt service, and only about 5% in all other things. And in terms of where we get our revenue, 78% comes from property taxes. So essentially property taxes pays for salary and benefits. State funding is only about 16% of our budget, and all other revenue sources, just 6%.
Could you give an example or two of what would be an all other source item?
Food services, Medicaid reimbursement, those types of things.
Just noting that all federal funding is within that all other. Yeah, I found that surprising when I first joined the board. I didn't recognize that.
Yeah, all federal funding, making sure that everyone's clear that that does not include our federal grants. Those are grants and considered grants and not included in the local budget that I'm showing you right now.
Okay, so grants would not be considered revenue in this pie chart.
Correct.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Yep. All right, so our biggest funding source, property tax. This is just a history of that. We get fiscal year on the left, our property tax levy, school tax rate associated with that levy, and then the percent change over the prior year. 2023, the property tax levy was $104 million. Tax rate, school side only, tax rate 705, and that was a 4.1% increase over the prior year. Again, this has varied substantially, with 5% being the highest tax rate increase we've seen in the last 7 years, and 0% in 2021. I do want to remind everybody of that line in 2022. I'm sure you're all aware that that's the year of the property tax revaluation. So prior to the actual revaluation taking place, the property tax rate went from 11.69 to 12.15, and then that is a net neutral conversion to 6.77. So the 3.9% increase you're seeing is the difference between 11.69 and 12.15, and then converting to 6.77 and moving forward thereafter, in case that is just a little confusing point in the slide.
Thank you for that. I have a quick question about the 2021 line. I'm curious about whether the 0% is related to the pandemic and the
Very much so.
Yeah. Okay.
It was that was the year where we presented the budget, and then like 3 days later, everything changed, and then we targeted along, discussions with the city, meeting a 0% tax rate target. And we also had the benefit of some federal funds, and that's when we did the custodians and but yes, very much so.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. And so, even though it's a smaller part of our revenue picture, the volatility of our state funding is a major challenge for us, I think, as you all are aware. So this is just a chart of our state funding history. Again, fiscal year on the left, the total subsidy, the change over the prior year, and the percent change. So here we know, unlike the budget, we know what our funding is now for 2024. I think most of you are aware that we are seeing a loss of funding of $2.4 million with a total subsidy for 2024 of $19 million. So that's an 11% reduction over the prior year. I think an important thing to note here with respect to this year, so with respect to the 2023 line, is that although you're seeing 2.5 million, I think I addressed this in a prior meeting, but it's worth saying again, even though we're seeing a $2.5 million reduction in 2023, you see this giant increase the previous year in 2022, 30%. That happened late in the budget season too. We did not budget that full 5.6 million in our operating budget. We repurposed 3.4 million to a debt service reserve, which was a great idea at the time and served us well and will continue to serve us well. What it also did was make it such that because we didn't budget that, when we lost 2.5 million the following year, it actually seemed to our operating budget as a $900,000 increase. So this is the first year where we're really feeling that pain of the reduced subsidy. And yeah, the story here is really volatility. We've been expecting decreases for some time, and it's great that the state increased the funding levels of 2022, but then to have now sharp reductions henceforth is just a challenging to manage. So that's the state funding picture. Next slide.
I actually have a quick question about, and it might not be a question for you, Miranda, but and if it isn't, you can just say, no, that's not my area of purview. But I'm curious about whether the $19.1 million is set in stone or whether there's any potential fluctuation in that number up or hopefully up, as conversations occur in Augusta over the next short period of time.
I mean, I would say it's definitely not set in stone. It's not likely to change much, but it's not really set in stone until the budget is passed in Augusta, right? I don't actually know exactly where they are with that at this point in time, but others on the call may. The likelihood of it changing, I don't know. I can't really speak to the likelihood of it changing materially at this point, but I think it's unlikely for this year.
Yeah, in the next slide, I'll talk again a little bit, just brief about how that figure is established, and just in terms of the EPS methodology. It would take adoption of tweaks to the formula, and so there may be other to prognosticate on the politics of that, but that's what would be one of the primary things that would influence whether that number changes or not.
Okay. Board Member Figdor.
Yeah, my experience is sometimes there are small kind of technical fixes that shift the number slightly, but not meaningfully in terms of kind of not meaningfully.
Okay, I appreciate that. Board Member Opperman, go ahead.
Exactly what Emily said. I was up in Augusta on Friday and speaking to the person who crunches the numbers. The only kinds of things that might change would be if we put in requests for some technical reconsiderations within 30 days of when we received the notification of it. And anything that's done on the changing the percentages and the calculations has to be done by the legislature. And so that would be something that would not happen this year.
Okay. Thank you so much for that insight. I'm sorry to derail the conversation. Onward.
Yes, so just a little refresher again on now that we know the funding, the basics of how this is calculated just at a very high level. So you've seen this slide before, but just to remind everybody, the EPS formula is basically two key parts. We have an operating allocation and we have a local contribution. The operating allocation is basically the state's calculation of the resources required to provide an education in a given district. The local contribution is how much that municipality they think should cover of that operating allocation. So the end resulting subsidy is the operating allocation minus our local contribution. Key drivers, there's a lot of drivers of operating allocation, a lot of reports and statistics that drive what that number is, and then the drivers of local contribution, as I'm sure you're tired of hearing by now, is property tax valuation and mill rate, and that's it. So the mill rate is uniform, applied throughout the state, and our property tax valuation is the key driver of our local contribution. And the next slide.
Board Member Opperman, go ahead.
The one thing I found out in Augusta was that the property tax valuation is not the one that the city has given us, but it's one that the state determines from averages of our market value, which is why we got so crazy. It wasn't the city doing it to us, but it's the wonderful increase in the property value in Portland. So that's what I discovered.
Thank you.
But it is based on the state's assessment. And for many, until we did revaluation, there was a big difference between the city's assessment and the state's assessment of our property value. And so now that we just did revaluation, they're closer than they ever have. Well, closer than they've been in many years, which is a good thing.
We also have a question coming in through the chat because Board Chair Lentz is participating by phone. She wants to know at what point in the year enrollment and demographics data get pulled for the purposes of enrollment and demographics in the operating allocation.
It's in the fall. So generally, we're scrambling to get the enrollment reports in to make sure that everything is in time for the EPS calculation. So it'll be our October 1 figures.
And so if, for example, there were a lot of people that we've welcomed to the district in more recent months, that wouldn't be reflected in the calculation, correct?
That's right.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, the belief is that it then lags. Those are then accounted for, right, in the following year. But
yeah.
Okay, Board Member Opperman, go ahead.
Well, it has to be the enrollment on October 1. That date is the enrollment. So we have to have a lot of kids in school that day, so we know, or actually enrolled at that point. The thing that I found very interesting, and I know because of the free lunch situation, that people are not bothering filling out forms on their economic status. And there's actually a simplified form where people do not have to reveal their income, but only indicate that they are eligible because of a particular formula that is demonstrated. I guess that's one of those things that you all put out in September, but it's the kind of thing that with people having tough times, even temporary tough times, would be really great because that would increase some of our calculations on the EPS. So
yeah, my understanding, folks on the staff, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that has been a huge challenge, particularly with every student in the state of Maine getting free lunch. It's less impactful for families feeling as though they need to get that form back to us, right?
Yeah, that's why.
Yes. Yeah.
That's a messaging reframing conversation for another day, but yes. Okay. Super. All right. Onward.
All right. Next slide. So this is just a high level kind of summary of the ED 279 itself and how some of the key allocations, some of the key figures. It's a 5 or 6 page report, and it's available online for anyone who wants to pull it. This is kind of pulling out the key numbers. So the operating allocation, which is mostly the enrollment stuff. So all the stuff we just talked about, enrollment-based and enrollment-based statistics, comes out to that top line there. And then you have other types of flat allocations for gifted and talented, career and technical ed. I should not have put that acronym there. I should have spelled out the words. Special ed, transportation, buses. Now the buses, that allocation you're seeing, FY24, $340,000. That includes the buses that I just referred to in the previous presentation that were approved for purchase this year. If we were to not purchase them, that funding would go away. Teacher retirement, education service member allocation, which please don't ask me what that is. I can't remember off the top of my head. I meant to look into that. I forget. It's the same year over year, so it's not really meaningful. And then the debt service, which you can see is also something that I referred to. Now they took that debt service away from our funding in FY23, put it back for FY24. That is actually accounting for $1 million of our allocation increase. In reality, if that never happened, which is kind of a random thing, we'd be losing $3.4 million this year. So just to give you that perspective, we're actually losing more this year than we did last year. And we lost $1 million last year because of that. So we actually lost only $1.5 million, and it's really $3.5 million this year. So the trend is downward this year. It just gets confusing with some of the, technicalities of it. But ultimately, the key end result here is that our allocation went up by $5.4 million. That should be a good thing. That is a good thing, except for the fact that that was more than offset by our increase in our local contribution expectation. As you can see, the valuation, which as correctly noted previously, is the state equalized valuation, not our city's valuation. And it's actually a 2 years trailing 3-year average intended to mute the impacts of substantial valuation increases, yet still, this is what we're seeing as an increase despite all of that. And that is driving our allocation down by, I believe that piece was, I do have it noted. I think that's driving it by about $6 million, I want to say, and then the rest by the mill rate. But together, you can see they come out to an increase in our local contribution of $7.8 million, which more than offsets our increase in operating allocation and results in a reduction to our subsidy of $2.4 million. So in this case, both the mill rate went up and our valuation went up. In prior years, the mill rate had gone down, even though the valuation went up. So that's why we're seeing kind of a double whammy there, and a funding loss. Any questions on this? Okay. Is there another slide? Yes. Okay. So last slide on this topic is just really to show that 16% that we receive in subsidy from the state, and compare that to other districts across the state and see how much of their budget is paid for by state subsidy. It's a very substantial variation. Lewiston sees approximately 70% of its budget paid for through state subsidy, and we only see 16%, with Cape Elizabeth at the bottom there, among the selected communities here. It's just the communities that we found relevant to compare to in the past is down at 6%, but that's very low compared to what a lot of other communities are seeing from the state. So just for that perspective.
This is eye-opening. In a future iteration of this grid, it would be like the question that is loud in my head is the local budget, what that means in terms of per student, because it doesn't really, this doesn't say, well, how many students is the city of Lewiston educating? So in a future iteration of this grid, it'd be super to sort of have that, included in terms of what that means for what each district is spending per student, just as a matter of, comparison with everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Okay, I think that's it for this section. If anyone has any questions, and then we might shift gears.
Let's shift gears.
Okay.
Great. So I'm going to just step you through some of the key investments we've made in the Portland Promise over the last several years. I just think it's helpful to get some transparency into what we've been trying to grow toward. So you'll see in just a moment on the next slide how it breaks down by each year, but just high level, the big things that we've been investing in since the launch of the Portland Promise are first, our behavioral health continuum. So both the creation of the Breathe continuum as well as adding social workers, investments into our ESOL team in alignment with our ALLOW plan for our multilingual learners. We've made some significant investments in special education. So Breathe sort of fits under special ed as well. But in addition to that, our Beach program is our program serving students with on the autism spectrum disorder, as well as the creation of the RISE program, which came along when the state changed the age eligibility rate and moved it up for students who are eligible to continue receiving services through the district. And then you'll see we made some key academic investments. So this is really in the realm of curriculum and coaching and teacher leadership. And then I think folks are familiar with the fact that we've been expanding pre-K over the past 5 years. We just talked about that at the board meeting. And as a part of that, that's been the barrier reduction work that Alyssa Bork spoke to, such as the addition of transportation for students in pre-K. And then finally, a set of investments that are aligned with our diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So those are the key themes. And then if you move it forward, this gives you kind of a snapshot. I know there's a lot of text, but I really liked having all the years on the slide together. So we can pause here for a minute, but basically you can kind of see where we were making kind of the more substantial investments each year over these past 4 years. So across the board, you see the pre-K expansion. And so that first year, pretty significant expansion. We added 13.5 FTEs. So that amounted to both teachers and ed techs. That's also a point at which we added DLL teaching capacity, as well as some coordination in terms of our central office team who's managing and coordinating all these partners in the program. This was also
super quickly, just also for community members who might be watching and also for me. What does DLL stand for?
Oh, it's the dual language learners. When we use that term when at this age range, because they're learning both languaguages. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yep.
And then stop me if I do something like that. I apologize. I know it's something that happens in education. I know my husband's in the military and they do it too. It's just a different set of words. and
Totally get it.
Yeah. So no, appreciate that. The next big investment is the Breathe continuum. So this is the year we added 26 FTE to create the full continuum. So this was a couple teachers, largely ed tech, so the BHPs, as well as a big investment in social workers. So we added 5 social workers for Breathe that year. And then finally, we invested in some of the academic work. So specifically STEM teacher leader, a middle school math coach, and then some curriculum at the middle school and elementary level focused on math and phonics. The next year, we continued the pre-K expansion and then worked on shoring up the Beach continuum. Specifically, this was the year that we added high school Beach. And this was a little bit connected to the Breathe work because we started to get more clear and precise about the distinction in terms of which program served which profile of student. And so we had kids that were previously really meant for Beach in the Breathe high school room. So this allowed us to give them the appropriate services. And we were also expanding the elementary a little bit and then continued to invest in academics, specifically the math curriculum and continued investment in phonics. That being said, this was a year, and we saw this earlier, that we were really focused on no tax increase. So we really delayed a lot of our academic investments. We eliminated elementary Spanish this year, many of you may recall, as well as reduced our athletic spend. And this was the year we were shifting costs to care, as Miranda talked about the bus piece of that, or not the custodian, sorry, as one of the big changes we made there. And that enabled us to get that 0% tax increase. And then in 2022, continued investment in pre-K. This is the year where we were able to address the transportation addition for these students, as well as continued to build out the beach continuum and added the middle school program. This is when we launched the RISE program that I mentioned before, and this is housed at Deering. And then we made a big investment in our LAU plan this year. This is our ESOL department serving multilingual learners, adding 15.5 FTE that year. We also were investing in social workers. We added 3.5 social workers, and then continued that investment in academics in terms of coaching. So focus on high school this year, as well as bringing in a little bit of our Wabanaki Studies coordinator to the local budget. We also were able to advance some significant diversity, equity, and inclusion investments this year. So this is when we moved Barrett's position, who is the director of DEI, into local. We created the BIPOC pathways position that Julia Hazel holds, who many of you know, as well as the equity officer position. And that was in line with our policy work and stipends for educators in the buildings for that as well. And finally, we increased the pay for parent community specialists this year, both the rate as well as putting them on a 12-month contract. So it was a big year in terms of what we accomplished around our Portland Promise goals. And then finally, this past budget was continued expansion. I wanted to highlight the addition of social work in pre-K as well, expanding the RISE program, more additions to the ESOL team, 5.5 FTE, focused at PATHS, Portland Adult Ed, and then a little bit of elementary and high school ads there. Again, more social workers added. In the curriculum realm, continued to kind of advance the work that we had started, added some social studies, pre-calculus, and as well as more assessment tools. This was also the year we were able to make the shift around having elementary librarians. You might have recalled we had ed techs, and we positioned those as teachers. So we had savings there because it was a reallocation, but still some increase in the budget. And then this is when we enacted the new high school equity staffing enhancement and made a little bit of an add to Casco Bay in terms of a Make It Happen coordinator in the local budget. So that's really, these are the only two slides that kind of give you this lens into what we've been doing over these past years. But I think it's super inspiring to see what our community has supported. And I think hopefully helpful to see that there's been significant increases around mental and behavioral health, special ed, ELL, pre-K, and then academics. We're going to move into this year's context. So does anybody have questions on that before we move forward?
I just have a quick question around, so the FTEs that were added in over the last 4 years, I'm curious about whether, so like they were added in the budget, I'm curious about whether we've been able to fill those positions or whether those also represent vacancies.
I mean, we can give, like you asked for before, kind of an update as to where we are, but one place where I know there are open vacancies is Breathe. So, you know, we've heard feedback recently that concerns about our resource investment in Breathe. You know, from where I sit, I'm like, wow, we've put millions of dollars into Breathe, actually a major investment. But as far as how one might feel on the ground, not all those positions are filled. And so obviously then it feels like they don't have the resources because they don't, you know,
right.
That's the true experience. So, yeah. And I think same with Beach, like some of those special programs have been some of our hardest to staff and to retain this year. So that feels like a little dissonance potentially for folks who, you know, you see all this investment, but like on the day-to-day, it can feel very strained.
Yep, that's exactly that's why I was asking that question. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks. Great.
All right. Well, we'll keep going in terms of, okay, so where does this land us now? You know, we got a little bit of that from Miranda's history in terms of how we've rolled up to where we are. So again, a quick, you know, kind of high level, you know, some of this we shared initially, but, you know, our initial calculations of kind of our rollover budget with cost increases is estimated at approximately an $8 million increase. So that's a 6% increase in our overall budget. We have the state funding loss that we just detailed of $2.4 million. So that leaves us essentially with a gap of over $10 million that we need to account for. And that is where we are, you know, in terms of a tax rate, just with the rollover and accounting for the $2.4 million state funding loss of that would suggest a tax rate increase of 9.3%. We have had, initial preliminary discussions internally of some budget pressures and potential additions, that we're facing as we head in and look ahead to fiscal year 24. And that nets out in the ballpark of around $5 million. So if we're accounting for all of that, both the rollover costs, loss of state funding, and what we're seeing on the horizon in terms of budget pressures or potential strategic additions, that would imply a tax rate increase of 14.2%. So obviously, significant figures, well beyond, and we'll talk about this in a moment, well beyond, where we've been as a community in any recent year in terms of potential increases. So just to provide a little bit of initial context, and again, I'll just kind of go through these briefly. We're still in the process of, as Malia will talk a little bit about, in terms of our engagement process, weighing what these are, how to prioritize them in terms of what we may or may not bring forward, ultimately in the budget presentation that we'll have on the 14th. But as you saw in Miranda's first presentation in terms of costs around special education, we are seeing significant increases in terms of both the tuition costs as well as the transportation costs. So trying to account for that and looking ahead to the coming year. So that's something that is on our radar in terms of budget pressures. As we have been talking about, and as you saw recently in the context of the city, and, we as well currently are housing some families, at one of our school's gymnasiums overnight. We have significant pressure around additional new arrivals. So thinking about the supports to be able to ensure we're able to meet their needs. So, that, goes all the way from intake and just kind of how overwhelmed our, staff is in terms of being able to bring folks in, the family and community specialists to help facilitate that and engage with those families, providing the kind of case management and social work needed for those families to be able to get settled, access services. And then, of course, the language development needs from our ESOL staff. As we've talked a fair bit about, and certainly some of our operational issues have given rise to, we're forecasting, potential budget pressure around operational costs, the ADP transition as it relates to payroll, HR staffing, both of those were mentioned, in the recent Spin-Glass report, and, increased transportation costs as we try and, meet our transportation obligations to all of our students. A couple other budget pressures or, kind of additions that were, are on the radar that we're trying to determine how to manage or prioritize. We have the reduction in grants. So we have both, some, kind of specific grants that we have had over the past couple of years. So come to mind like our BAR grant, from the BAR Foundation that supported some of our post-secondary readiness work, other kind of specific grants that have supported, for example, the mobile maker space, and then some of the, looking to the horizon of anticipated reduction and elimination of our federal ESSERF grants. So we're mindful of that, that those are, supports and services that our students and families and staff have been experiencing. And so, while those are would be new costs on the local budget, recognizing those have been existing services. So trying to think about how to manage those. And then there are some other kind of big, potential items that we need to think about how to prioritize and what we bring forward given the budget context. So, again, as we've spoken about, we're kind of moving into this last phase of pre-K expansion. So additional costs there certainly offset some potentially with revenue, but thinking about the budgeting those up front, we've been exploring in certain around gaps in our literacy curriculum in terms of updating that in alignment with, newer and deeper understanding around the science of reading. And then some additional kind of, buckets of things related to staff climate and culture, certainly a primary concern for us to be able to create the kind of conditions that help us retain staff in a difficult climate. And then there's a handful of things that are kind of site-based specific that individual building leaders have potentially put forward that we're weighing amidst all these other strategic pieces. So this gives a little bit of just insight into the things that we're trying to assess in terms of prioritization, and feasibility in the context of preparing our budget as we move forward. So a few kind of considerations for you all. We'll kind of open it up to some initial discussion here now, but as we kind of move forward into our formal budget processes and deliberations, based on what Miranda shared, our average cost increase has been just above 4%, with the highest at 6.2. Tax rate, average has been 3.4, certainly dragged down a little bit in that one year that we had the 0%. So highest was 5%. So the figures that we're really kind of talking about for this year, are certainly well above these at this starting point in our process. Certainly, we're still a good ways away from finalizing our budget presentation, but our initial kind of forecasts are coming in well above these figures. We're all aware of the continued pressures that inflation has kind of driven for us, and that's a factor in where we're at. So, as we think about this and continue to deliberate, cheat sheet a little bit is, that every 1% on the tax rate is roughly equivalent to about $1 million in costs. So as we think about, making revisions down in terms of tax rate, that, starts to then equate to kind of X number of $1 million. So if we're trying to reduce by $2 million in reductions we're trying to look for. Conversely, if we're increasing it, that's an additional $1 million that we're able to allocate towards strategic investments. So just a little bit of a kind of easy rule of thumb as we move through our deliberations over the next couple months. The last slide here is just in terms of context is one that, we've shared a number of times around our ESSER funding. So as we go into fiscal year 24, this is the final year of ESSER funding, currently projecting approximately $5.5 million to both continue activities or allocate into the new year. We'd initially done an kind of prioritization of maintaining about 3.5 million of those costs, and moving about 700K to local investments. But I would say, now that we have the state funding figures, we're looking at that whole bucket, and will be, part of what we're thinking about. Certainly, part of what will engage you all in terms of the most strategic use of our last year of ESSER funding as we move forward. So before we get into what's next, any clarifying questions about any of that FY24 budget context?
Yes. So that last slide, the 3.5 million, the ESSER, I'm curious about whether that would or could potentially offset the, essentially, that there was a previous slide that said, if we kept everything and we added in what we want to add in, we'd be looking at a 14.1% increase. And so that is about $14 million. So I'm curious about whether this 13.5 or the 5.5 would offset that.
Certainly in part, I wouldn't say in whole. There are some activities, that in the initial prioritization were assumed we would want to continue, that may not be accounted for in, those additional budget pressures or adds. So certainly there's the, the remaining of, after we go to the 3.5, I think it was like 1.6 or, 1.4 would be the figure, I guess, that certainly, had been nominally tapped for the participatory budgeting work. So that's certainly, on the table for how we consider those funds. Some of that 3.5 million as well is duplicative of, things that are in the, budget pressures and additions, but some of which are not. So there's some of our, behavioral health investments, for example, in terms of middle schools and secondary schools, that isn't necessarily repeated there. So those will be, strategic choices about what we put forward and how we choose to leverage those resources.
I would just add,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
No,
I mean,
go. Yeah.
I think there's an opportunity here for us to maximize this. Of course, we have to talk strategy long-term. But just also one other comment is that we will be looking at what's in the 3.5 to make sure that we still, like we'll do with everything, believe that all of that is essential for next year. And there are particular parameters around these grants, what's allowable, and what's in our projects, but just wanted to mention that piece as well.
Okay. Two other quick questions. Sort of similar question, whether any of the numbers from Miranda's slides are potential offsets for these horrible numbers that we're looking at here, or whether that would, have they already been accounted for?
Do you mean her earlier, when she was talking about some of the reserves?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is our plan, is that we're going to look at what, like Miranda mentioned, she's looking at a multi-year strategy for that. So that will very much be part of the strategy, the whole overarching strategy.
And then my other question would be around the budget. So the amount that we're going to budget for fiscal year 24 around staffing, and just sort of having a discussion about what's realistic in terms of filling all those positions. Just in terms of the ability to fill positions this year has been very, very has been challenging, and I'm curious about whether you're expecting the same thing to be true as we go forward. And so just to not to have that conversation right now, but just to sort of that's one thing that's popping around in my head in terms of whether to, whether it makes sense to budget for a bunch of roles that may go unfilled. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think will absolutely make sense. And it's absolutely something we have to look at. And, like I mentioned, district programs is a place where I still feel like we need to be doing a lot of work to try to fill those positions. They feel essential, but in terms of looking at them holistically, absolutely, that's a question mark.
Okay. Board Member Opperman, go ahead.
Board Member Biden, I understand your concern about where to cut in or not plan for, but my concern is that when this happens, that the student direct contact positions are still sought actively, and positions that are not in direct contact with students are considered non-essential. That's just my statement.
No, that's an important layer for sure. Thank you for saying it. Okay.
Let's keep going, because I think with our timing.
Yep, I agree. That's what I was going to say. Go ahead.
Yep. So Maria, you want to speak to what's next?
Sure. So just wanted to make you all aware that in terms of where we are with our process for getting input so we can bring forward a recommended budget, we're in the midst of conversations with our admin team, both about how people are thinking about their priorities, as well as generating creative solutions for ways we can reduce, reallocate, or find cost savings measures. So that's a step that's in process. We also have been looking at some of the themes from the listening sessions that have been happening, both for the superintendent search and some of what we're hearing from you all from your listening sessions, because we think that's also a lot of input. So those themes are going to weigh in and inform some of the thinking on this process as well. And then finally, we're working on strategies for all staff engagement. So we're going to be using the next 3 Tuesday bulletins to send out some videos to just try to create a little bit more transparency into the budget. I think we are aware of the fact that we do a much better job with the board educating folks around the context of the budget and the priorities than we do with the internal team. And so that's something Erin and I are aware of and wanting to prioritize this season, as well as we have some different ideas for how we might gather some additional and broader staff input. And we don't have the precise plan for that. We're looking to do that Tomorrow's bulletin will give a version of what we just did with you all. And then the next one is going to talk more about priorities, and that's on the 28th. And when we're trying to have some sort of a strategy for engagement there, and just trying to be really mindful about how to frame that so that it's not performative, but authentic in terms of information that can help inform decisions. So just wanted you all to be aware of that. And then on the next slide, with a little bit of time we have left here, we just had two questions that we wanted to propose and see if we could talk about for a few minutes, which are just what, to the extent you know, some of your initial input around your 2 to 5 kind of key priorities for this budget. That's one of the questions we're asking our team. And so we've been taking tons of notes and trying to kind of see what themes are emerging. So wanted to see if there's some space for your input, which might evolve and change, but just kind of understanding where folks' thinking is at right now. And then secondly, just making sure we're clear on what additional context you would need to support your decision-making process. So wanted to open it up for some conversation for these last 10 minutes.
I will give it a minute and see if Board Member Opperman and Board Member Figdor want to chime in. Go ahead, Board Member Figdor.
I can say at this point, with this level of information presented, certainly prioritizing the HR staffing and ADP transition would be a high priority for me, as well as continuing the pre-K expansion and continuing our equity investments. I mean, those are just the top 3 that, in my mind, at this point in the process.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Board Member Opperman. Go ahead.
My thoughts are what I've started to say, in that what is important is what goes on in the classroom, so that any kind of direct contact, individuals that can help the students meet their needs, whether it's emotional, whether it's academic. Our job doesn't work if we plan, and nothing happens in the classroom. And that's where I think, as you look at what's going on, my priorities, I think, would be, ask that question: where is this going to affect actual delivery of service to a student? And that piece. The other one is, when you're talking about support, I don't know when you're talking HR, I would say finance. I think the need or organizational needs that have been brought up for at least 3 years now in audit about and need to get enough staff that can turn around a monthly financial statement so that we know what's going on without having to dig back 6 months. I guess those are my 2 priorities.
I'll echo the need to make sure that we're fully staffed in terms of running all, finance and all those processes effectively. And then I'm not going to list 5, but I was just so excited to see on the slide the literacy curriculum as a parent of second graders. Yes, I really support that. So yeah, let's go. Anyway, I could talk for hours about that, but we only have 6 minutes left. So is this the last slide of this topic, or
this was our last little bit of input.
Okay.
And so, sorry, that's right. We were just going to highlight the next few meetings that are coming up here. Yeah.
Super.
I had a question about, if I may,
yes, go ahead.
This forum. How does that work? I don't, what's the context? Are we meeting in person? Who comes to the forum? How do we do that? Mm-hmm.
Good question. I think it's been kind of run, and Emily and Miranda, please weigh in. It's kind of been run like some of our Parent U events effectively in past years. So it's really a background building kind of around the budget, how it comes together, what the kind of key components are, for the community. So it's community facing, kind of the nuts and bolts of the budget and how it comes together, so that as we enter into the process, there's some basis of understanding. Oh, hey, Grace. Go for it.
I just want to say that we have been doing the budget forum for a number of years now, for many years. And it is part of the Public Affairs Committee's work. And so this is one of their charges, that they, promote this and lead the work on the forum. Okay. So in the last few years, after, during the pandemic and post-pandemic, we have been doing this online. And before that, it was always in person.
Thank you.
And I just want to say that Board Chair Lentz has added into the chat that her priorities are essentially, she's tracking along with what Board Member Figdor said, plus BIPOC staff pathways and support. So just noted. Thank you so much, Chair Lentz. We have 4 minutes. Oh, go ahead, Board Member Figdor.
I just wanted to say if Chair Lentz had additional comments, we did, our board policy is to allow all board members to participate in committee meetings. So I wouldn't want to not hear from her.
No, I think it's a combination of the order of operations of when I saw the hand go up and the chat. And so it was not, Chair Lentz, I was not intending to exclude you one bit. Anyway, I also want to be mindful of the time. We have 3 minutes left. Superintendent Townsend, is that enough time for you to give us a brief update about the IRS issue?
Sure. And I'll say, again, I'll post, as soon as I get it. I have not received anything. But, what I'll share is, that, there are essentially 3 kind of categories of issues that we've been working on, over the past few years, really, with the IRS. One relates to the filing of our quarterly federal tax withholding report. It's called a 941. In October 2019, we got notice of, an error from December 2018. There's, some kind of compounding effect of that. So we got multiple notices ultimately because it played over into subsequent quarters. But all of those penalties have been addressed and have been abated. So we did not pay any penalties associated with that, and all of those have been corrected. The second bucket of issue related to what's referred to by the IRS is the next day deposit rule. So this is when an employer exceeds a $100,000 threshold for withholdings for any individual pay period. So, that then they're required to, deposit those the next day, thus the next day deposit rule. So there was a period of time, in 2018 when we exceeded this threshold and staff were unaware at that time. And so there was, so there were penalties initially assessed around that. And again, we have, formally those have been abated and, that issue is resolved, and have mechanisms in place and hasn't been an issue since. So the last one is kind of the remaining penalty that's out there, which is the $1 million penalty. This was assessed for missing the reporting deadline for the Affordable Care Act. So initially it was approximately half the penalty was at that time was they had assumed that employees hadn't gotten their 1095. So this was around, providing employees their 1095 forms to say they were covered as part of the Affordable Care Act, as well as, half the fine was for the reporting to the federal government. It was determined following that, once that notice, kind of came forward, that we actually had met the deadline for providing employees their 1095s. So, in terms of the federal reporting, that was at the time when we were actually transitioning to Munis at that time. And so there had been software issues with the uploads with the prior system. And ultimately that was resolved and the federal government got the reporting. So our IRS agent said, based on ultimately the documentation, that we did meet the deadline for providing employees their 1095s on time, in the understanding around the software issues, and that was remedied. They've recommended, that the $1 million fine be abated as well. And so we anticipate that to come through and are just waiting that final determination and communication back to be, clear of.
Just to confirm, in subsequent years, the 1095 forms and the reporting to the federal government have been on time and fine, right?
Right. We have not had issues
Okay.
since
Yep.
that time.
Super. Okay. Board Member Figdor, go ahead.
And the $1 million fine was in 2018.
Well, yeah, it was, it was for the reporting for tax year 2018. This all happened in, the early winter of 2019.
Thank you.
But yeah, it's in respect to that.
And so do we have a sense of timeline in terms of it, when it will go from probably going to be abated to a sure answer? Do we have a...
When we got the notice on January 4th of the next day rule abatement of penalties of the 88K, and they anticipated we would hear shortly. I don't know how IRS defines shortly. We have not heard yet. We've put in inquiries to our, kind of IRS point person that we've been working with, but haven't heard back. So, but suggested in the documentation, that we would be hearing soon.
Thank you for the update very much. All right, we have gotten through all of our agenda. It's 6:02. I apologize for going over by 2 minutes. Dr. Valenzuela, is there something you'd like to add? I see your hand up.
I just want to add that, I want to say that the website has now a link for the budget development page. And so it is there under finance. So we will keep adding to that Google Doc. So for instance, the calendar is there for the process, the budget process. It's already posted. And then this meeting, for instance, will be showing up there after, once we have edited it. So it will be the place where we'll be putting all our documents in so that they're all in one page.
One-stop shop.
Yep.
For budget things. Super. Thank you very much for that. What a way to end the meeting on a high note. Cool. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. I appreciate your time. And we are wrapping up at 6:03 p.m. Thanks, everybody. Meeting's adjourned.
Good night, everyone.